Hello again, everyone. I'm Tom Nagorski, managing editor at the Cipher Brief. We're here to talk today about the kind of tantalizing potential for an endgame in Ukraine, which has been put on the table by the incoming Trump administration, specifically by his envoy for Ukraine, retired General Keith Kellogg. A plan to negotiate an end to that conflict within 100 days of the inauguration. We're delighted to be joined today, as we are with some frequency, by General Ben Hodges, former commander of U.S. Army forces in Europe, joining us from Germany today. And General Hodges has, as I said, been a frequent contributor. And I wonder, you've helped us on so many Ukraine-related things for years now, General, as a member of our Cipher Brief network. And just as a starting point, when you hear 100 days, we're going to have a deal. It's obviously not the 24 hours that President-elect Trump had said many times during the campaign. Still an ambitious target. What's your reflexive reaction to that timetable?
Very skeptical because what we still don't have is a clearly defined outcome. I mean, stopping the fighting is not a strategic outcome, because I think anybody that knows Russia, pays attention to what Russia does and has been doing, that won't be the end of it. So I'd much rather hear the incoming administration say, our desired strategic outcome for the situation in this part of Europe is X, and therefore negotiations are going to get us there. So that's why I'm skeptical.
Mm-hmm. Well, taking that skepticism into account and then looking at some of the elements that have been put forth, and again, we very few comments, but we have some from General Kellogg and other members of the team. It's kind of an interesting mix, I think, of things as disparate as boost American oil and gas production to, I guess, lessen the revenues that the Russians are going to get from their output in that sector. Buffer zones in Ukraine for an outcome there, I guess, of keeping the Russians from ever pushing further westward, and talking to Vladimir Putin, which of course is something that the Biden administration wasn't going to do. Reactions to those, or any other elements that you've heard of what has been put forward?
So I was encouraged when I heard General Kellogg a little while back talk about on the prospect of negotiations. He said publicly, "You cannot trust Russia." That is an excellent starting point for negotiations with the Kremlin, is acknowledging that you cannot trust them. So any idea of Russia says, yes, of course, a ceasefire, yes, of course, we'll respect this, they're not going to do it. So that told me that General Kellogg, who I've known for many years, understands that any agreement will have to have a very strong, compelling compliance protocol. For example, I also was encouraged when I heard him publicly say or talk about the importance of Ukrainian sovereignty. This is very important. I mean, when you talk about why do we care about Ukraine, and what's the end state, the restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty, which includes Crimea, by the way, is important, not just because we really like Ukrainians, but because this is a deterrence message to China that the Chinese, of course, will see weakness if we're not willing to defend sovereignty of European countries. Then I think they will not be too impressed with things that we say about the Philippines or the South China Sea and other international law aspects of international law, particularly with regards to sovereignty.
As a military person and a long-time, not just expert of, but resident in Europe, short of NATO membership, which does not seem, at least in the short term, to be in the cards for Ukraine, and you talk about sovereignty, and then that gets us to security guarantees. What else could be on the table or in the cards if, as you say, that's something that General Kellogg and the Trump administration will take seriously?
Well, look, President-elect Trump is going to take office next week with much more leverage over Vladimir Putin than he had 8 years ago or even 4 years ago. I mean, regardless of what's said in public, the fact is Trump is going to inherit a very strong U.S. economy. He's going to inherit he's coming in office with enormous domestic political support. He's got 31 NATO allies that are looking for U.S. leadership, and most of them will follow if the U.S. says we want Ukraine to win because it's in our collective best interest. Then almost all of them will do stuff to contribute to that. So plus the other partners. So there's a lot of advantages that Trump has. Putin, on the other hand, much weaker now than he was a year ago. The obvious hundreds of thousands of casualties, lost equipment. The Russian defense industry is in the toilet. And they lost their Syrian ally, Bashar al-Assad. Russia did not even have the capacity to save Assad and keep doing what they're doing in Ukraine. I think the Trump team sees this, and that maybe their own calculation is changing about how they interact with Putin. I mean, candidly, several years ago, Trump looked like he really wanted to meet Putin, and he talked about Putin being savvy and a genius and a winner and all that. He's not anymore. And so I think how Trump views his relationship with Putin is in a much different place. Hopefully, he will use that leverage to benefit of the United States, but also that means to Ukraine and Europe. And he has a couple of things that are already on the table that he doesn't have to do a single thing, but they will help Ukraine. There's $2 billion worth of aid that were already authorized and appropriated by the Congress. Trump doesn't even have to say a word. Just let that keep going, because that's $2 billion that the Biden administration failed to deliver, did not get it out the door. These sanctions on Russian shadow fleet vessels that are carrying Russian oil to India and China, leave those sanctions in place. I mean, those are already being recognized, if you will, by India and China. So he can leave that in place. And then also the fact that the other sanctions, lifting of restrictions on ATACMS by the Biden administration, leave that in place. So there's boom, 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 three things that are making it a little bit more difficult for the Russians, and President Trump doesn't even have to announce it. He just leaves it in place. So he's got so many advantages. And what I hope is that the administration will use that. They don't have to go to negotiating with the Kremlin hat in hand.
Now, speaking of negotiating with the Kremlin, I mentioned before the Biden administration was not about to go see Vladimir Putin, indicted war criminal, or unless he changed his posture, so on and so forth, whatever their reasons were. Mr. Trump has said, I think he said it just in the last 24 hours or so, he's going to meet him. He's going to talk to him. We had former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, on our platform a few days ago, and he said, this is more of a diplomatic point, sure, talk to Putin, but just give him a phone call. Don't bless him with a meeting until he's shown some sort of, more positive actions. What do you think about whether it is a good thing or a bad thing for Donald Trump to, wherever it happens, meet Vladimir Putin as these negotiations get underway?
Well, in this case, I would agree with Ambassador Volker. I mean, Kurt is an expert diplomat, and he understands perceptions of things like this. And I would agree, especially, I mean, if President Trump has this leverage and this advantage, don't give it away by going to meet Putin somewhere, which is going to be a pretty limited number of places because he is indicted. Most countries would have to arrest him if he went there. So I think a phone call is not a bad idea. But again, it has to be, hey, let me tell you what, Vladimir, this is the deal. You know what? Ukraine is a sovereign country. It is in the interest of the United States and all of our allies that you are defeated, that you leave Ukraine and you live within your own borders. You're zero risk of you being attacked by any NATO country. So stop worrying about that. And I hope he does not automatically, and this, you reminded me, one of the things that General Kellogg, they talked about, no NATO membership for 20 years or something. Why in the hell would we say that? NATO will get better the day that Ukraine joins the alliance. The Russians, though, they don't care about Ukraine joining NATO. What they care about is a a Ukraine that is prosperous and free, and Ukrainian people that are doing extremely well right on their border. That's what he dreads more than anything. Now, you open the door on the security guarantee. There is no guarantee other than NATO membership. I've seen and heard all kinds of different formulas for how that might be worked out, even if part of Ukraine is still occupied by Russia. I think at the end of the day, unless you have U.S. troops that are there on the ground, or some kind of European force that looks like it could defeat any Russian formation that might attack, because the Russians will absolutely test it, then we don't need a bunch of blue helmeted guys from some other continent that are there. They will not be respected. They seldom are. It needs to be something like the NATO implementation force that went into Bosnia back in 1995. But the Ukrainians are not going to sit around. I mean, they know that they were not prepared back in 2022 when the large-scale invasion started. I was in Kyiv about 3 weeks before then, and right. Kyiv did not feel like a city that was getting ready for a war. So this time, I think when and where and however the fighting comes to a halt of some sort, I think the Ukrainians are going to get to work very quickly, fixing, improving, growing their own military, growing their defense industry, and fixing all the problems that they have now, so that they do become this porcupine that Russia will not want to attack again in 3 years once Russia has fixed all their own problems.
Right. Last question, General. You've talked about Russia's position, which you suggest has weakened recently going into any potential negotiations. A lot of people think they see similar issues on the Ukrainian side. Manpower issues, slow but steady losses in the east. Is that a fair characterization, or do you think Ukraine would come to this a bit more from a position of strength?
I think the Ukrainians actually have a degree of confidence, and President Zelensky has also, I think, been very pragmatic and practical in how he approaches the Trump administration. At the end of the day, the Ukrainians know that who their neighbor is, who Russia is, and that if they just quit or they give up or whatever, they know what the consequences are. So they're not going to do that. The Russians also understand that they cannot keep doing what they're doing. And so it's a little bit, for the Russians, the only hope for them is that the West, particularly the U.S., turns its back on Ukraine. And so Putin believes he can win because he doesn't care about casualties. On the Ukrainian side, of course, President Zelensky has to worry about casualties, but I don't think their problem is manpower. There's probably 1 million Ukrainians that are military age women and men that could serve without lowering the draft. I mean, I thought it was a terrible statement by Jake Sullivan to blame the Ukrainians for not drafting enough young people, as that's why they're not winning. But then that's been part of the current administration's whitewashing effort to make it look like they did everything they possibly could, which is obviously not true. But it also, Mr. Waltz then compounded it by saying the same thing, basically, hey, look, if they want us to help, they're going to have to lower the draft age. That's not the issue. The Ukrainian government has failed to earn the confidence of enough Ukrainian families that their sons and daughters won't be wasted. So this is what the government has to prove to the population, that this is not the old Soviet prison army, that their son and daughter will not go to the war until they are properly trained, properly equipped, and put in a unit that's properly trained and equipped.
We're going to have to leave it there. General Ben Hodges, it's great, as always, to have you with us. Your insights are super valuable, especially at this moment. And Happy New Year, by the way. I didn't say that at the outset, and I'm sure we'll be talking again before too long. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you, Tom.